Hello, and we'd like to welcome all of the viewers out there watching this today. This is the second in a series of webinars hosted by Total Practice Solutions Group to inform the viewers about the state of the veterinary practice and sales market right now. So today with me, I've got Dr. Bill Crank and Dr. John Brick. Dr. Brick is an Ohio State veterinary school grad. He's been a practice owner for many, many years, still is today, and is a founding member of Total Practice Solutions Group. Dr. Crank was a 1991 graduate of Ohio State Vet School as well, is a former practice owner, and has been with Total Practice Solutions Group since 2013. So welcome today, guys. Glad to have you guys as part of the panel today. And we're going to move forward with some questions and inform the viewers today kind of what's going on with the veterinary market. So let's start off with saying that in our first webinar, we kind of touched on the state of the market as far as what corporate consolidators were doing, what interest rates were doing, and we kind of talked in generalities. Some of the feedback we got was that people wanted to know a little more detail. So we're going to drill a little bit deeper in some of those aspects. So what we want to talk about is, so Bill, tell me on vet to vet deals, what are you seeing as interest rates that lenders are offering right now on practice and real estate? Where is that line right now, and kind of what do we expect to see happen with those interest rates over the short term?
Well, over the last 2 years, as everybody knows, the prime rate has grown up dramatically. A couple of years ago, we were getting veterinary loans for 3.5% to 4% fixed for 10 years. And the last one I saw yesterday was 8.5% fixed. That's a dramatic increase, and it really has somewhat lowered the value of our practices, because when we do our debt services, that increased rate is costing that buyer quite a bit of money just to make those payments, and just lowering the amount of money left over for
them. Absolutely. We're going to talk a little more about that as we get further along. John, are you seeing anything different with that, with some of the deals that you're doing? Are you seeing 6.5, 7, 7.5, 8? What's your thought?
No, I think the lowest I saw was 7.5, and we're at 8.5%. And it's a 10-year loan for the practice, a 20-year loan for real estate with a 10-year balloon, and the buyer needs to have 10% down for the real estate.
10% down. Okay. Some lenders are still requiring 20, but 10 sure helps them out for sure.
So, well, they've tried to go down a little bit on that because of the increase of interest rates.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's talk about multiples for a minute, because everybody always wants to know, well, what's the multiple on the practice that I'm buying? Obviously, 2 years ago, year and a half, 2 years ago, corporate multiples were going crazy. Obviously, there's a certain multiple that vet to vet deals that banks can lend money on, and there's kind of a maximum there. But what are you guys seeing now? And John, you can speak up first. What are you guys seeing now on corporate transactions, that for those corporate groups that are still buying, what are you seeing for multiples in their offers now?
Well, a couple of years ago, I saw multiples of 15 and up to 20. Now I think the multiple is going between 8 and 12. And to get a 12, you need to have a 4-doctor plus practice. I think the days of the 15 and 20 multiples are done. And I think a lot of that is because corporates have a certain amount of money. They buy practices, and then they borrow money from the practices they own, and they're having the same situation that veterinarians are having, that they have to borrow more expensive money.
Right. So Bill, tell me what are you seeing on the as a multiple on the practices that you're assuming are a vet to vet deal that aren't a corporate candidate? What's kind of your average or your range of multiples that you're seeing when you're doing valuations on those?
Well, the range would be 4 to 6, 6 being a really outstanding practice. With that interest rate creeping up, getting that 6 multiple and still having a fair debt service is almost impossible. So honestly, 4 to 5 is probably what we're going to be able to get through a bank. Unfortunately, as those interest rates go up, the value of a practice has to go down. We try to set it up so that the buyer can make 110 to 120% of the cost of living in that area. When they buy a practice, they have to be able to pay all the debt and still make a living and make more than they would have made as an associate. So, yeah, I think 4 to 5. Getting above a 5 would have to be a really outstanding practice that has an extremely great cash flow to support that loan.
Right. Okay. All right. So you touched on this a minute ago, Bill. Maybe John can elaborate a little bit on that. How are you seeing interest rates affecting the value of practices specifically, and explain a little bit about why that is? John, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, it's all about cash flow. After you pay the debt of the practice, the debt of the real estate, you have to have money left over to pay the fixed bills, your help, your utilities, your drugs, and then you have to have money left over to pay veterinarians. Well, as interest rates increase, the debt service of the practice, and if you're buying real estate, that increases too. Thus, it lowers your cash flow. So that is why interest rates are lowering practice values. Now, what I have seen is the practice values are lower, but they also are much lower if you're buying real estate versus leasing a building. The fixed lease of the building is roughly the same. When you sell the real estate, because the interest rates have gone from 2.5%, 3% to 8.5%, you're paying more for that real estate. Thus, because of cash flow, it even drops the practice more. I've seen practices worth up to 30% less than they were worth back when the interest rates were 2.5% and 3%.
Wow.
Yeah, he makes a good point, Richard. If you're buying the real estate and you're buying the practice, you're paying that 8.5% for both of those loans. So that's like John and I talked about it when a few days ago we were talking, and we looked at a practice and we looked at the debt service on it. It was $1 million practice with a $500,000 piece of real estate attached to it, and the practice value would have been 30% higher 2 years ago with rates at 4%. So it makes a dramatic difference. It really does.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's affecting the sellers of practices, I think, more than the buyers of practices, because that leads me into kind of my next question for you guys is is your position with buyers then the fact that they really shouldn't really worry about the interest rate being 8% over 6 or 6.5%, because that's already baked into the value of the practice that they're buying?
That is correct, Richard.
Would you guys agree with that and talk about that a minute?
Yes, that's correct. Actually, they're paying less for the practice than they would have 2 or 3 years ago, and because they have to pay a higher interest rate. It's almost a buyer's market, because when the rates do drop, you can refinance, so you'll actually get that practice cheaper by refinancing. The seller, on the other hand, he or she is selling it now for a lower price, and they're not going to be able to get more money when the interest rates drop. So it is actually a buyer's market.
Right. And that leads me to my next question. You guys are just following right along with my thought process here. So what are you guys seeing as far as the number of practices on the market right now? I know that I've got more practices listed than I've had in years. And most of them I've listed, the majority of them I've listed in the last 90 days. So that tells me there's more veterinarians looking to sell. Now, they're mostly 1 to 1.5 doctor practices. Are you guys seeing the same thing? And is that creating a buyer's market?
I'll take that one. I think we are seeing a constant flow of veterinarians who are ready to retire and want to develop some kind of exit strategy. And yes, we have quite a few practices out there on the market. The one good point that I want to bring up is, it seems like 3 or 4 years ago, or even 5 years ago, there were a lot of associate veterinarians that wanted to buy practices. And when we put a practice on the market, we had buyers pretty quickly looking at them. And it's really been discouraging to me this past year and a half. It seems like we have a lot of practices for sale, but we don't have a lot of buyers out there looking. And I think that's also created a bit of a buyer's market, because if you have the gumption to jump out there and buy a practice, they're out there. You can find them. And it is kind of a buyer's market, because if someone's been trying to sell practice for a year and they've only had like 1 or 2 offers on that practice, and you come up and you make a good offer, you're probably going to get that practice. So I hope that kind of in a roundabout way answers the question. But yeah, we're seeing quite a few sellers, and we'd like to see more buyers.
Great. Yeah, we're seeing that, we're seeing the same thing. I think it's still a great time for buyers to get into the market and buy practices if that's their goal. And we'd certainly like to see more. Encourage any viewers that are watching this today. If you're a buyer, it's possible for you to buy a practice. There's lending out there, there's financing out there, and there's practices out there to buy. So Bill, you touched on this a little bit. My next question is, how long are you seeing the typical practice staying on the market? Because mine are staying on the market a little bit longer than normal, as you mentioned. So what, when somebody asks you, how long is it going to take you to sell my practice? And it's a typical solo doctor practice with maybe a relief doctor that's working part-time. So we're calling it a 1.5 doctor practice doing $1 million. How long is it taking you to sell that practice now? And I'm asking this to give those sellers a realistic expectation of what they can expect if they're ready to go to market.
Well, I'll talk first, and John can follow up. But it depends on location. Honestly, location is the number one thing that sells practices. If you're in a place like, say, Charleston, South Carolina, I can probably sell that practice in 3 or 4 months. If you're in a rural Pennsylvania or anywhere, away from a large metropolitan area, I have practices that's taken 2.5 to 3 years to sell. So John can speak to it too. I think it's just, and it's discouraging, and sellers get upset because why haven't you sold it yet? And we try to be upfront with them and tell them, we've got it advertised. We've got it in all our ads. We got it on Google, Facebook, and still we have to find that buyer who wants to live there and practice veterinary medicine.
Yeah, John, what's your thought on that? What are you seeing?
I absolutely agree with Bill. It's all about location. And the other thing about location is a lot of the 1.5 doctor practices that have the older veterinarians, it takes 2 of the younger veterinarians to run those hospitals, because it's a different time set and time frame of how veterinarians work. A lot of us, when we got out of school, a 40 to 60-hour work week was not uncommon if we owned a practice. A lot of the young veterinarians have gotten out, and corporates will pay them for a 30, 32-hour work week. And that's what they'd like to have when they own a practice, which is perfectly fine because you need family life, and it makes it a lot easier. So I think, like Bill says, it's about location, because if you do sell a 1.5 doctor practice in Philadelphia or Charleston, the people that buy that have an easier time of finding another veterinarian associate to help them to do it. Whereas it's hard to find a veterinarian that wants to live out in a rural country.
Right. All right, guys. I got 2 questions left. Bill, I'm going to let you take the first one. What is your advice for a vet looking to buy a practice right now?
Well, my history of coming out of veterinary school and jumping right in and buying a practice probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. I probably should have took my time on that, but it all worked out with a lot of hard work. I think the only way that a veterinarian can really succeed in life, if you want to have financial stability and a retirement and, have something of your own that you can sell down the road, just to be a buyer and an owner of a vet practice. I see so many people that take that responsibility, own a practice, and in 10 years their debt service is paid off, and they're just, they're very successful people, and they can do whatever they want. Where if you're tied to a job where you're working for somebody else, you're kind of set at what you can do. You're never going to really be able to jump ahead of everybody else. So I think it's always a good idea to own your own practice. The only detriment is, yes, there's responsibility there, but your whole life is responsible. You have to be responsible for everything you do, and taking that responsibility of being a owner is just one more step. So I think it's a great time to buy a practice. As we talked about, even though the rates are higher, those increased rates, whenever we figure the debt service, we have to lower the price of the practice. So I think it's just as good as time as any to buy a practice right now.
Great. And John, what would be your primary advice to a seller that's looking to sell a practice right now?
Well, I think when you sell a practice, a lot of the people that are selling practices, it's just time to retire. I mean, I think selling a practice is like getting in and out of the stock market. You just can't wait for that specific time when interest rates go down. It's when you're ready to sell, you need to sell. But what I would tell the sellers is, don't wait for the interest rates to go down. And it might be another 2 years when you just don't want to work anymore, and you've slowed down and your practice has dropped in gross revenue. The time to sell the practice is when it's at its peak and the gross revenue and the net are the highest, because that's when we can get the most for your practice.
Great advice. So we want to thank all of our viewers today for watching this webinar. We want you to know that all you need to do is call your Total Practice Solutions Group broker in your area to get the best advice, the best service. We're here to help you maximize your value when you're ready to sell, and we're here to help buyers buy the practice of their dreams. So if we can help you, contact your Total Practice Solutions Group broker at your earliest convenience. We're here to help. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.